think of space, we naturally think of the stars, solar systems, galaxy, the distant reaches of the universe.
But space has another dimension to explore, not outward, but inward, into all the basic elements of everything there is on our planet.
Here, a miniature world of space exists, a world filled with constant motion, one that went undetected for centuries. It is the world of the atom.
So today we're going to talk a little bit about existentialism as a philosophical school. I suppose we'll talk a little bit about the basics and the genesis of existentialism as a philosophy, and then go into our own thoughts about it. So existentialism, when you talk about it, inevitably the name Jean-Paul Sartre comes up. He's considered the founder of the existentialists. In a lot of his works, beginning with the novel Nausea, and going through work like Being and Nothingness and other texts. A Frenchman, this philosophy kind of came about after the Second World War, almost as a response to Europe's crisis through the two world wars. So I guess the thrust of it comes from Kierkegaard and Heidegger. Does anybody want to comment at all on early existentialism?
Well, just if we had to define it, the essence of existentialism, would you say that it would basically be, from what I've understood, and I haven't really done a very thorough study on existentialism, but basically the idea that your existence comes first and foremost, in defining who and what you are.
Right. Sartre, his main credo is existence precedes essence.
Okay, right.
Right, and since Platonic times, it had been the opposite, that the essence of a thing, what a thing is, it defines its existence. Well, Sartre didn't believe this.
Okay.
He believed, for example, that a human being existed first as a human being, right? And his essence, his or her essence, was the result of the choices they made to impose labels on themselves, right? So your essence isn't that you're a car salesman or that you're a music enthusiast, right? That isn't your existence. That isn't who you are, right? That's your essence. Those are things that you choose and put upon yourself, rather than what you actually, are as an existent individual.
Right. But someone didn't choose what religion they were born into, or what family cultural upbringing they brought into. So I guess at some point they can choose.
Yeah.
Right, but how does he distinguish between things that are just sort of culturally inherited?
Well, Sartre talked about facticity, right? Those are the facts that make you up, okay? So, it's a fact that you were born, say, into a Catholic or Muslim home.
Okay.
Right? It's a fact that you were taught about those things, you were involved in a religious community, right? But what he said, that's all function of essence as well. Because in the end, every human being does, have the self-aware choice to incorporate those beliefs into their behavior and lifestyle or to reject them. Okay, so everyone, it is the problem then becomes like the radical experience of freedom and responsibility that gives an individual. You know, um, well, I do these things because of my faith, right? And Heidegger actually talked a lot about in early existentialism, like his own, like the Christian moral sense that existed outside, you know. But for Sartre, it wasn't about moral choice. It was about the fact that you had a choice in the first place, even if it seems like you don't have a choice, that you're being forced into something by, cultural, societal standards. You do still have a choice. You still have the ultimate responsibility for your actions. So yes, if you grow up, it doesn't seem like you have a choice but to be a Christian in a Christian community, raised, you've never experienced anything outside of that community. It doesn't seem like you have a choice, but that's an illusion. The reality is you do have a conscious choice.
And then as far as something like a biological impulses.
Yeah.
Did the existentialists really talk a lot about that? Like a genetic inheritance towards aggression or
right.
You name it.
Well, I've never heard much from early existentialists about, except they would frame it in naturalistic terms, right? The natural man has these impulses. But again, you have a choice whether or not to follow those impulses, right? So as rational actors, as agents, you have the ability to take in those things and reject them if you desire, right?
It's interesting because I think that's a relevant. Obviously, it's always really been a relevant philosophical issue. The idea of nature versus nurture.
Sure.
And how much control we have over our pre-inherited impulses, and I tend to think, as with I tend to think of a lot of things, it's a both and sort of situation.
Mm-hmm.
Right? I
mean,
we're born into a certain cultural upbringing. We have a certain genetic makeup. I know a new field in genetics is what they call epigenetics. Mm. So, for example, if my mother was an alcoholic and constantly under stress, that would actually affect my genetic makeup.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Yeah.
And it doesn't have to go back thousands of years. It could happen as soon as my mother could have a profound effect on my personality, of what diseases I was predisposed to, right?
Sure.
And then never mind the culture I end up getting flung into.
Yeah. Right.
And that's gonna activate, bring out certain predisposed traits and so on and so forth. But I think it's liberating that existentialism has such a strong belief in choice.
Right.
Despite all of that, you still have a choice.
Exactly. And that's that's the frightening thing about existentialism, but also the most radically liberating thing about it. Although there have been people who have said that existentialism's radicalism is an illusion in and of itself, but I don't necessarily believe that, and it can be used to justify. I mean, look, if a criminal has an ultimate choice, right, to make that crime, that's the foundation of our legal system, right? But in a lot of cases, of course, somebody is pushed into a situation where they commit a crime, right? So, I mean, you have all these forces that are acting both for and against, and I think what the key is the realization that you have an ultimate choice, right? Because most of us, in our daily interactions, we don't feel as though we are even making choices. We're just doing things and responding.
Right.
Whereas I think a truly existentialist, living life authentically, as the existentialists would say, is making choices with the full knowledge that you're making a choice, and the full knowledge of what the repercussions of those choices are. It's
interesting because it's I mean, I like to think of myself as a somewhat rational human being that can make somewhat rational choices. And there are times, when I do go into autopilot mode, and I'm sort of just like, I take a back seat and let life take me wherever it may. But I think I do think that's crucial. I think that's crucial. It's half the problem here with our culture. No one wants to take the responsibility and start, living their own life, living their own destiny. They all want to jump on the bandwagon for some sort of political idea or religious ideal, instead of stopping and acknowledging what makes them happy as an individual, and follow their own personal value system.
Right. Right, because an individual truly can't be defined by their facticity, right? By their political affiliation, by their skin color, by their age group, right? People can't be defined by those things, or at least the I, or the you can't be defined in those terms, right? That kind of whatever consciousness is, whatever personality is, can't be defined by those terms.
You guys really jump right into this. I there's a couple of things I wanted to go over in the beginning. Dostoevsky, he said, if God exists, everything will be possible. And Sartre,
everything is permitted, isn't it?
That he may have misquoted. I'm reading it from Sartre's his work on his brief essay on existentialism and human emotions. But he says that is the very starting point of existentialism. And one of the interesting, one of the well-known quotes of existentialism is, "I think, therefore I exist," or "therefore I am." And it's that recognition of that point that shows the burden that each individual has in the collective humanity, because you yourself are not the be-all end-all, but every action that you yourself do has a direct effect on all of humanity and all of existence. So therefore, just that alone is a burden, which is one of the existentialist ideas that when people talk about the idea of quietness, of being inactive, when you realize this burden is upon you, it tends to make you be inactive and to not want to mess anything up, because you realize the profound effect that you play. But the whole point of existentialism is to act, and to realize that without action, even inaction is itself action. And it's a recognition of the actions that you're doing, and trying to do whatever the idea of correctness is in that term, however I guess however you determine it to be.
Right. It's almost like we're in a constant struggle to define ourselves and our values, rather than let something else define it for us. And it is a struggle. It doesn't come easy. I mean, at least for me. I mean, it's constantly, and even something that I feel like I believe in at one moment, by learning more, having a little bit more life experience, I may change my mind. So even what you define yourself as is a fluid construct, right? I mean, even that is something that's probably at some point going to change. Yeah,
and Sartre believed that as well, that everything was in constant flux, right? That even culture and history themselves are not static, that they're constantly changing, have always been culturally, constantly reinventing themselves. That human beings are the same way, and it's that idea, that idea of action versus inaction and responsibility, especially Sartre. Actually, all the existentialists were all very political, right? But Sartre believed in such an absolute freedom and responsibility that he said that even not acting in that realm, not acting to stop injustice, for example, was to become part of the injustice, right? So just through inaction, you are tacitly supporting injustice in the world. That by doing nothing, you are still acting. You're still acting on the world, right? You're still an agent. So it's. I mean, this is why he framed things in such a using terms like burden. One of his famous quotes is "Man is condemned to be free," right? That it's a huge burden having absolute freedom, because in the end, then, if we have absolute freedom to create anything, we are then all tacitly responsible for the world that we live in.
Right.
It goes to it also. He talked about when you say that you care about something. He used a really good example where he was talking about a kid who he lived with his mother. His parents were divorced. His older brother was killed in the war, and he wanted to go off and fight in the war. And this was back in the 40s, during World War II. He wanted to go and fight in the war, but he was torn between staying and helping his mother essentially live because she was living through him, or going and helping the greater cause of fighting Germany. And Sartre, he talked about how in that point it is only you that can decide what means justifies the end result that you're trying to achieve. The ends in both of those situations were either his mother or fighting in the war, but if he chose his mother, then the means was the war itself, and by choosing the war, the means was then his mother. So it's one of the things that he talks about is going to when you're looking for advice on what you should do in that type of situation. Say you go to a priest. Well, you're choosing to go to that priest. You already have a good idea of what that priest is going to say to you based on what it means to be a priest. In the same respect, when he went and talked to him, when he went and talked to Sartre about it, he kind of already knew the response that he was going to give him. So in a way, even though you may be looking, you can make any type of interpretation that you want of a situation. You interpret signs and words however you're going to interpret it, however it fits into what it is that you're looking for. So ultimately, you're still the one that makes the decision. But as we stated, the decision still affects all of humanity. In that case, it was by not fighting in the war. He ultimately didn't fight in the war, but by not fighting in the war, that was potentially he may have potentially saved someone's life in the war, or as an indirect result, if he would have fought in the war, he could have lost his life, or his mother may have gotten worse and died during that period of time. So it's a catch-22 really when in the core of existentialism is that no matter what you do, you'll never know what the opposite would have done because you chose to do what you did. So therefore, that is the reality that you've created, and the other reality can therefore not exist because you've chosen the reality that you've chosen.
Unless there's some kind of Schrodinger's cat situation somewhere off in the ether,
Yeah, and you know what? That might very well be a possibility.
Right, many
mean,
worlds theory. But yeah, a lot of this revolves around the idea that inherently, there's no moral compass saying you should or should not do that action, right? That you should go to the war, or you shouldn't. Now, of course, a state might say, well, to be patriotic, you must go to the war, or someone else might say, well, you need to help your family first, but those are constructs in and of themselves, right? And they're not derived from any kind of central outside moral actor, right? So the thrust behind existentialism is that the world is inherently indifferent to you and your actions. I mean, it's meaningless beyond what meaning we project onto it, right? So we create the meaning of the universe just by creating structures, by thinking about it, by recognizing it, by seeing it.
That's sort of the idea of man creates moral code.
Yeah.
There is no higher power that creates it. They're all man's words. That's actually the atheist existentialist view, specific to Sartre. That's actually his viewpoint on he. Interesting to note his view of his atheism, where he says that there's no immediate creator God, but that there is still one thing from which all of this came, and that we cannot perceive that because we are the action of that one thing recognizing all of this, and therefore we cannot recognize that one thing because we are the projection of that one thing. It's an interesting take, and I personally don't consider that an atheist model, but I find
it's
it
more
interesting.
agnostic, really. Yeah.
But it's an interesting take, and I would agree with an atheist if they went along that route. But I think that actually speaks to a higher level of understanding of, it's the idea that the human does not exist until the human calls themselves a human. The recognition of itself as a human being.
Right.
That's sort of the core of the existentialist thinking of understanding of things. Something doesn't come into being until you say that it is that thing. Up until that point, I guess it's up for interpretation.
Right, and that's a lot of what Sartre was talking about in Nausea, right? So Nausea, his first novel, is kind of the exploration of this man's existential crisis and breakdown, right? He begins to see objects not as the thing that we call it, like a pen, for example. You see a pen on a table, you recognize it as a pen because that's culturally, it's what it was created for, that's what its purpose was, right? And you don't think about it. Well, he begins to question whether or not, just objects have any real meaning, right? I mean, is that a pen on the table, or is it just this strange thing, this meaningless object, right? Does it have a purpose beyond the purpose that he projects onto it? And he starts to have this crisis. There's a scene where he's sitting in a park and he's looking at the root of a tree, and it becomes this just horrible, meaningless, disgusting object to him. And he begins to have these feelings of deep anxiety, and nausea, because the world around him and its meaninglessness starts to sicken him because he's lost all sense of meaning to the world. And that's what the existentialists would call realizing the absurd nature of the universe. That it's so well ordered, but really, are we just imposing our conscious order upon it? It's that kind of that moment. There was an allegory where it's as if someone's standing at the brink of a cliff, and in that moment they have that existential angst or fear, because at any moment they could throw themselves off of it. There's nothing stopping them from doing so, and what reason do they have not to? I mean, they realize they have the absolute freedom to jump off or step back, right? There are no outside forces working on that decision. So it's that nausea explores those concepts deeply.
But we do have a genetic. We're hardwired not to want to kill ourselves. On some level,
right?
Now I guess if you're awfully depressed, your life is in shambles, you could still override that programming, but we still have an impulse to sort of protect ourselves and to protect our well-being.
Absolutely, yeah. And that's almost as if It's almost as if then it just comes hardwired with consciousness that we can even have that idea, right? Because there's no, a tree has no desire to kill itself, right? Human beings, though, through our choices and the things we create around us, have the ability to feel existential angst and anxiety, and we have the capability to have that kind of depth of despair where we would consider overriding the overwhelming natural impulse to stay alive and kill ourselves. I mean, there's even a quote somewhere that's here. It's been said that the possibility of suicide itself makes all humans existentialists.
Right.
That's E. Keene from Suicide and Self-Deception. It's a psychoanalytic article.
I mean, going back to the concept of the absurd, where basically there's no meaning besides the meaning we give it. Perhaps, I mean, I always think of it as maybe the meaning is to create meaning. Maybe the meaning is to create and project our abstractions.
Yeah.
I mean, maybe on an anthropological level, that's sort of true. I mean, humans are here to create culture. That's one of the defining characteristics of the human, right? Mm-hmm. Is the level of complexity of culture we put out.
That's not something I disagree with. No, I think that's an interesting idea. Because it seems like we're the only beings that are really capable of creating meaning.
Right.
So, I mean, the utilization of that force itself is probably something we're hardwired to do.
Exactly. So we can't not create meaning.
Right. Yeah.
Do we really need to create a meaning, though, for all of this? When you think about it, if we like to say that we are the conscious awareness of reality. So, to take that in a philosophical idea, if there was this essence that is all, and that it is somehow projected its awareness through us as human beings, could that not then just be that existence rationalizing and making this all seem worth the trouble of the creation itself? Because this continues to perpetuate, is there really a meaning behind it other than the meaning that we're creating it to be? Other than that, it just is. It's just existence. It's just things happening. And even call it existence is just a word that we use. It just is, really.
Yeah.
So, it to create culture, to further civilization, those are ideas that we've created to justify our existence and to justify our awareness.
Right.
There's no proof inside of reality to say that is the reason why we're here. That's just the justification that we've created for ourselves. And it seems a rather arrogant justification when you really think about it. A deer is not trying to conquer lands or create skyscrapers. A deer just is. It's just living. It has no desire to do such things. I think if the animal kingdom did, I think you would see animals just killing animals for no apparent reason. Humans do that.
Yeah. I think it's sort of a catch-22. It's on one level, we create culture, we create ideas, and then on another level, we're defined by it. We use language to describe the world, but at the same time, that very language colors our experience of it. So it's like a weird...
And necessarily limits it.
Right, absolutely.
Yeah.
What's the quote? The moment you define something as something is the moment that you limit it to that definition.
To name it is to know it.
Yeah, absolutely. But I think that it goes back to the statement, existence precedes essence, right? I mean, we look at the world and we give it an essence, right? We give things names, categories. we assign behaviors and meaning to them, right? But you're right. In the end, it all just exists. You know, we're here just because we're here. You know, existence is something that is separate from the meaning that we impose on it. You know, reality itself, however you want to define it, I mean, that's a definition. You know, I mean, all the objects around us are essentially just, you know, energy vibrating at certain frequencies. You know, I mean, we're only really perceiving things through the limits of our central nervous systems, and then
and that's a new idea.
It is a new idea. Yeah, it's something we really just on the cusp of truly understanding. And to tell you the truth, you know, just the other night I was starting to read some things about quantum mechanics, because I was going to see Dr. Kaku lecture soon here, Michio Kaku. And to tell you the truth, it's hard to understand any of it. I mean, it's paradoxical in a lot of ways. It's deeply involved. You know, the basic concepts are profound. Mm-hmm. But if you start digging into, you know, the how and the why of things, I mean, it's almost beyond the capability of the human mind to truly wrap around those concepts, right? I mean, these are things that we can't actually define.
Right.
You know, we can't define the behavior of subatomic particles in any meaningful way without creating paradoxes like, you know, Schrodinger's cat, you know. It's strange. So the universe just exists, and then we try to categorize and kind of sanitize it.
Right.
You know.
It's like in alchemy, they have the word coincidentia oppositorum. Right, the union of opposites, thinking in terms of both and both things existing simultaneously.
Right,
and that is a very I would even say countercultural way of thinking, because I think culture wants to nail you in one way of thinking or doing about something, you know. Yeah. Whereas it's not that easy. It's complicated. Like you said, in physics, you study physics, it's like, what the hell am I reading here? You know, how is this even possible?
I think one of the interesting ideas behind that, when you look at dualism, let's take the yin and yang, for example. You have the yin and yang circling around itself inside of a central circle. So from that one point, which is the circle, you get dualism.
Right.
And inside of the dualism, inside the yin and yang concept, even on the most extreme point of either side, there is the essence of the other side. So when you say something is something, well, that only then lends to there being an opposite of that something. So if we say physical reality, well, then there has to be a non-physical reality based on the idea of dualism at its core.
Right.
When you take the one thing, if we just say existence, if we define everything that is and is not as one thing, well, even just there, I just created dualism by saying that. But it's kind of funny. If you take that, then you realize that there has to be a dualism, but above that there is just that. So because we live in this world where we say one thing, there has to be that other. There has to be, or else reality couldn't exist the way it does. It would be something entirely different. And I think really that's what quantum physics is proving. I think it's with string theory, the ideas of the multiple layers of the universe, the ideas of there's an idea that all of this is just a hologram. There's just unbelievable ideas out there, and you know when you look at quantum physics, the only way to prove it is math, if that's even proving anything. But it's sort of the same thing as existentialism. You can say that you prove it through fancy words and ideas, but you're not really proving anything. You know, when we label something as something, that's not proving that it is what we're saying it is. If the consensus believes it to be that, that still doesn't make it that. It's at its core, it's just an idea. It's not real in the sense that we define real. Because we can't even prove that reality is real.
Right.
None of this could be real. But we look at it as real because we're aware of it. But what is even awareness, really, when it gets down to it?
So how could you take any idea or any value seriously?
That's the thing. I think that's actually one of the core parts of existentialism. When you get really down to its hardcore, it is that you can't really prove anything. And actually, it's one of the things that Sartre, he says, you know, it sounds like this very gloomy way of looking at things, that existentialists are very negative and depressed. But it's actually just the opposite. I mean, how enthusiastic. I mean, I consider it just awesome to realize that we don't know anything, you know, and we can't prove anything. I think that's great. I think that creates an infinite situation of all things being possible.
Right. All possibilities. You know, I think it's profoundly liberating in that sense.
Yeah.
In that, in a world that is essentially indifferent and meaningless, at least to us, that we can project these meanings, create structures, create ideas to kind of make our own world, right? And I think that's truly liberating. And we don't need this pursuit where we need to define everything, right? You know, that human conquering mindset that we need to bend the universe to our will, you know, but no, we can just exist in it and give it meaning simply by existing in it. I think it's a beautiful idea. You know, once you get over the existential, you know, the angst and despair as it defined in, you know, existentialism by, you know, Camus or Sartre, you know, once you get over that and actually can lead your life in an authentic way, it's almost, you know, they call it transcendence. It's almost a semi-mystical idea, you know, but, you know, very... You know, they were removing these ideas from the mystics, though, I think in a lot of ways. You know, like Nietzsche's, you know, God is dead, right? Where mankind was no longer constrained by some kind of religious moral code. I think that's kind of where existentialism sprang from, that concept that human beings themselves create meaning, right? Create whatever morality might be, and they were the ones who are the agents in that, not any kind of outside actor.
Yeah, one of the interesting ideas that Sartre talks about in one of his essays, he says that if God doesn't exist, that doesn't really have all that much of a detrimental effect on reality, because in reality, we're the ones that have created reality, our interpretation of reality. So we're the ones that defined actions as good and evil and or right or wrong. So if it was proven that there is no such thing as a God in the way that religion deems a God, that doesn't necessarily mean that the actions that we've considered to be just are now all of a sudden thrown out the window. We're the ones that have defined it as such, so therefore they are that because we have said that they are. Now we can change the way we view actions based on interpretation, but that doesn't change the action itself. The action is still an action. It's how we interpret the action that makes the action have the connotations that it has of being labeled as right or wrong and things like that. Really, at the core, it's just action and reaction. You have an action, and then there are an infinite amount of reactions that can happen from that action, and then you have that reaction becomes then an action that has an infinite amount of reactions, and it just kind of continues in that sense. And it's only us defining those actions and reactions that create the context of society, civilization, reality, all the things, all the words that we use to describe these various things.
Right.
Yeah, and the existentialists, especially when you start to talk about society as a whole, the focus is on the individual, of course. Everything we've been talking about thus far has been focused around, the individual experience. But they talked a lot about how societies were structured as well. First of all, as constraints on freedom, right? So you follow certain societal norms, okay, that necessarily limit your choice. Because a lot of people, authenticity, for example, somebody who is working a job, well, really, a lot of people are just playing at being that thing, right? Like, I am a steel worker, I am a lawyer, right? And they go through behaviors that they think that society wants to see in a lawyer, right? So they're not actually being their individual self, they're playing a part, a role. And it comes with this idea they called the gaze, right? Where you experience how someone else sees you in the third person, right? So we go around, we don't really think about who we are as people when we're walking down the street, right? I mean, we're just in our skin. Right. Now a lot of people might put forward some kind of look with their clothing or style or their lifestyle choice, right? But essentially, you're not thinking about you as in terms of a third person, right? The gaze is when you realize someone is looking at you and imposing their own idea of who you are onto your personality, right? So we can sit here and we all know each other, fairly well, but if we're walking down the street, someone's looking at us, they will make a judgment based on our appearance, our location, the way we carry ourselves. The gaze is the experience of seeing that you're being observed and feeling the imposition of that judgment upon you, right? So you're seeing yourself from outside of yourself, if you see what I mean.
Right.
So what do you think about that concept?
I think I know exactly what he's talking about. I experience it all the time, and I also want to say that not only do I experience it, but it's difficult to not allow the gaze to start affecting you and start fitting into that role that the person's imposing on you.
Right, absolutely.
In fact, I think it's a struggle to, when you have a group of people that perceive you in a certain way, to sort of constantly unplug from that, and start acting in a different way. I mean, I've had the experience of, for example, in high school, going out on the weekends with my friends and having a totally different personality. But then as soon as Monday morning came around and I stepped foot into the school, it was like I had some sort of neurological anchor, and bang, I was back to acting in a different way that I felt other people were perceiving me as. Right. So, yeah, I mean, I definitely noticed it.
Right, sure.
I look at it really simple. This is what I always say. Who the fuck are you? Who the fuck am I? But who the fuck are you? That's how I've always looked at it. At least when you get really down to the core of that, it is something that we all put on certain characters based on the interpretation of what we think we're supposed to be. But the thing of it is that when you are by yourself, the person that you are when no one else is around, that's you. Right. That's the core you. And then from there you put on layers. And you put on layers for fear that people will not accept you as you are, as your singular self alone. So those layers protect you, that if a person has an opinion on one of those layers, well, then you can just remove that layer if it doesn't suit you in reality. If you are just yourself and people do not accept you for who you are, well, then you can be at a crisis mode, because the true you is not being accepted by reality. But who is reality to say anything about who you are? You are you and they are them. We all are the same. We're all people at our core. And we are people individually perceiving reality for which it is, and it's a collective conscious awareness of reality that creates the entirety of humanity, but it's all individuals inside of humanity that creates humanity, so it's still all individual perspectives on the whole. So when you get into that, you realize that you play a part of humanity, you play a part of reality, and you are you. You cannot be anything other. So when it's like when somebody says, "Oh, you're not being yourself." Well, how are you not yourself? Even the you, even the true you, the essence that you are when you're alone, when you go into a group of people, that's you being what you want to be. You are creating the character that you are based on what you believe that group wants you to be, or what is called for inside of that group. But on the flip side, if you're being that, are you really being you? Or are you being the you that society wants you to be? So then that actually becomes an idea of freedom, of free will. Are you freely being yourself? Are you freely expressing yourself? Or are you expressing yourself in the way in which society's asked you to express yourself? Which, is that really being free? Is there really a freedom inside of society is really what it comes down to. When you're an individual trying to be the individual you versus the individual just being you. There's a difference between being and trying to be.
Seems like a struggle to me.
I think it's an endless struggle.
Yeah, I mean, it's just a perpetual battle to be you despite everything else trying to define you.
It's like the in Alice in Wonderland, the caterpillar, when he asks, "Who are you?"
Yeah.
When you ask that question to people, I don't think people can really answer that.
Right.
Because they say, "Well, I'm an accountant," or I'm a teacher.
But how is that you? Yeah,
that's what you do. Well, I'm a married person. I have kids, but that's not you though. That's what you've chosen for your lifestyle. And when you really keep pressing it, people get scared. They get nervous. They don't know how to, because they've never really sat. And that's one of the interesting things about what I just said, is that when you are yourself alone, that essence of just you, people are afraid of that. People are afraid to be in complete silence, because then it's them. They're face to face with themselves, and I don't think a lot of people really like what they are at that core.
They're terrified of it oftentimes, I think. And it is these structures that impose those things on us. Because you're so used to, living in our society, oh, well, what are the first things you ask somebody when you meet them? Oh, well, hi, my name's this, my name's that. What do you do?
Right.
Exactly.
Right. Well, that's a big question, and it almost always refers to what's your job? What's your job within, the economic system? Well, I mean, who arbitrarily decided that that's what you do? I mean, that's you.
Who you are.
Right. I mean, it's Sartre had a allegory about a waiter when he was talking about authenticity, right? He says, this waiter will come out and you could tell he's being too nice, too attentive. He carries himself, in a servile way, but you can tell that really he's just acting at being a waiter, right? He's doing these things because that's what a waiter should do, not because that's just what he's doing at the time, right? So instead of, well, yeah, I happen to be a waiter, it's I am a waiter. He's taking on that mantle, of that idea of a waiter, right? And that's something that's made up. It's a construct, it's essentially inherently false. It has nothing to do with him as a person, But I mean, yeah, it's one of the first questions. What do you do? Well, you could answer that in any other way, well, I eat and I drink and I sleep, you know what I mean? These are all things human beings do.
Right.
But it doesn't fulfill the expectation of the question.
Right.
And
it's scary too if you think of it in terms of that, because I mean, I know, for example, in World War II with the Nazis, I'm sure a lot of the Nazis were good people at heart, but they fell into this horrible regime and started doing atrocious acts just because that was the narrative that they had adopted. Right.
Well, you're just following orders, right?
Right.
Or you're trying to serve your country, you know, which had been, you know, disgraced after the First World War. You know, you're trying to have this nationalistic pride. Those things in and of themselves are constructs. That are,
Right.
you know, I mean, nationalism at its core is ridiculous. You know, it's completely arbitrary where you're born, or where, you know, even if you choose to live in a place, it's, you know, nonsensical just to blindly follow the national line of whatever government structure happens to control a certain geographical area. You know, I mean, none of it really makes any inherent sense. It's certainly not in the context of existentialism. I mean, Sartre, his whole life, and again, these guys were very political, but, you know, Sartre was involved with a lot of communist socialist movements, and toward the end of his life, he embraced anarchism. There's an article, Sartre at 70, where he says, "I have always thought that anarchy, which is to say a society without powers, must be brought about." Right? Because it fit into his existentialist worldview. He says, "By way of philosophy, I discovered the anarchist being in me. But when I discovered it, I did not call it that, because today's anarchy no longer has anything to do with the anarchy of 1890, right? You know, he didn't label himself as an anarchist. He actually usually wouldn't label himself as anything at all. But he politically and philosophically supported the ideas of anarchism and you know, communism, Marxism. But so he believed that these structures needed to be removed in order to actually fulfill the promise of existential freedom.
Right. And I think that's a valid argument, for sure.
Yeah.
I think, you know, what you were saying about the Nazi reference, I think that shows the extreme of what society can do to the individuals inside of it. And, you know, and getting to the existentialist idea of the actions that you do shape humanity. So because each one of those people willingly accepted their role as a Nazi, that created the situation of World War II.
It created a reality.
And that in itself makes them, regardless of who they were, that makes them all the negative connotations that go with the Nazi party. That makes them that, because they chose to be that. Now, whether or not it was a willing choice, you know, maybe they were afraid that if they didn't, that maybe they would be put in a concentration camp. Well, by making that choice, that still perpetuated the problem, regardless of whether or not they agreed with what they were doing. And that goes with all things in society.
Yep.
If you're present at a rally, or a political rally, or any sort of rally, and the person next to you starts, you know, inciting a real riot, you have a choice. You can either sit silently by and wait for the authorities to come over and try and take care of the situation. You can instigate it, or, you know, you can try and diffuse it yourself. Now, which of those situations is going to have the most direct, immediate result? When you recognize a situation, it is your choice to act on that situation. And you are the first line of defense for humanity if you're the first person to realize something. If you sit silently by and wait for others to realize it, well, it may get out of hand at that point. And then that becomes the situation at hand. So it's what's really cool about existentialism is that it just covers every aspect of the philosophical reality of humanity. It takes society apart in a very constructive and logical way, and rebuilds a society that is very constructed, but it's very deconstructed at the same time.
Right.
It's a constructed deconstruction, and it's a very sane insanity.
It empowers the individual. You know, I think that's why I mean, that's what I'm getting from it, at least. Because we're always told, oh, you know, you're marginal, you're periphery, you're just a number. What could you do? What could one person do? But really, we're players.
Right.
We're all players in this, and reclaiming that and fully acknowledging that is the first step in having a sane society, but in having your own personal freedom, is recognizing your own inherent ability to create your own narrative.
Absolutely, you know, and I think it's so vital to understand from this that no matter who you are or where you are an agent. You have agency, right? You have absolute freedom of choice, right? You do not have to accept indignity, right? You don't have to accept anything, but you have to be aware that you're an actor, right? You have to be self-aware. You know, I mean, it's the old injunction, know thyself. You know, you have to know who you are and what you are as a human being and what that means, and then take that information and act on it in the world, right? To cause effect, because we all can cause effect. We're all causing effects now, even through inaction. Now, if you can channel that into constructive, positive action in the world based on yourself, the people around you, right, and what you do and say, I mean, you can be a very profound and have a very profound impact on the world.
I get a very sour taste in my mouth when somebody says, "Oh, you're just one person. What can you do?" Well, what did Gandhi do? What did Nelson Mandela do? What did Caesar do? What did Napoleon do? What did Hitler do? What did Malcolm X do? What did all these people do? Well, they did a hell of a lot. And they were just one person. Now, yeah, they had a group of people around them, but they rallied those people around them. They inspired those people around them to do what they did. One person is all of humanity when you really look at it. And all of humanity is the collection of all those individuals. If you can't not be a part of humanity.
And you're unique.
Well, exactly.
Right.
And you bring a unique interpretation to reality, and you know, when you do something, you're doing it for the sake of humanity. That's actually one of the core ideas of existentialism, where the actions that you do is for the sake of humanity. It's while it's an individual doing it, it's an individual acting as all of humanity, because they are a part of humanity. You can't not be a part of humanity as a human.
Yep.
So, whenever somebody says that, whenever somebody says, "Well, you're just one person," they're selling themselves short horribly.
Oh, absolutely.
And I think that causes some of the lethargic ideas and actions of people. Well, it will be inactions of people, and that's not a good thing. That's not a good thing to adopt that viewpoint.
I mean, it's good when you have a culture that's based on buying things and consuming things, you know?
Right.
I mean, when you talk to someone and they go, I don't know. I work at some insurance firm. I do paperwork. And they've taken that on. They've taken that identity on, and it's literally like you could hear the dread in their voice.
Exactly.
And the utter the other despair that's what their life has turned into.
Yeah.
Doing crunching numbers at some office for the next how many decades. And it's sad, because they are more than that. They're a totally 100% unique being that's on this planet, but they haven't fully seized that awareness or that power yet.
It feels like so many people in the world are living inside of a Kafka story. Just that mind-numbing, absurd, bureaucratic, hell. And Kafka was himself, his work is considered existentialist because of those reasons. He talks about just the despair and drudgery of having been imposed upon by these structures and these things. You know, I would encourage everyone to pick up a copy of Kafka's short stories, you know, to really understand. He really gets across that emotion of anguish and angst. You know, I mean, we use the term angst to, you know, talk about 14-year-old kids' music. You know what I mean? You know, right. but angst is something that everyone experiences. You know, is it any time that you are sitting there and looking at your life and saying, man, I wish I had something more than this. You're experiencing angst, you know, and existentialism is about recognizing that and liberating yourself from it, you know, and I think there are a lot of, you know, in terms of activism and other schools of thought, there are a lot of other ways you can relieve yourself of that, you know, shed all that dross.
How does existentialism, how do they account for a future projection of who you are? Or like if you have some sort of artistic ideal, would they agree with that, or would they be totally against any form of ideals?
Well, I mean, it's about the personal choice, right? So as you make further choices, especially if you're leading your life authentically, I mean, anything is really acceptable.
Right.
You know what I mean? It's so long as you don't, you know, slip back into, you know, those I don't know what you would even call them, labels.
Right.
You know, it
let
basically
something else label you for you.
Everything falls into place once you see yourself as a rational actor, you know, as a being that has agency. Okay. You know. And the future, well, I mean, you know, as Sartre said, you know, culture is constantly changing, culture is constantly evolving. I mean, really, in every moment, the universe recreates itself, you know, which is, I mean, there's limitless potential there.
Mm-hmm. It's like a river. You never see the same river for more than a second. Yeah. It's constantly the same. Or, well, the old saying, you never step in the same river twice. But even, you know, like the idea, somebody says, oh, I want to be a famous musician. Well, even if you get notoriety as a musician, you're not that. That's just what you do. Yeah. That's not you. That's what you've chosen to do, I guess I should say. So really, the idea of existentialism in that sense is just being. It's just you are. You're being. You're not defined by what you do. You just do these things because you've chosen to do them. So it's not a. You won't be able to do those things until you get to the point of doing them. You either do them or you don't. So if you say, I want to be a famous musician, but you never pick up an instrument or never write a song, well, there's a very low likelihood of that ever being the case. So at the moment that you decide that I want to be this, then you begin doing things that get you into that. They give you the potential to be able to do that. But that doesn't make you that. That just is something that you're doing. So it's
And I think if you're trying to do something because you want to fill a role, like, you know, if you pick up a guitar because you want to be the idea of a rock star, right? I mean, that's not authentic. You just want to go into another role, right? Now, if you engage with art, music, and culture just for love of those things, that's authentic. I mean, returning to like Kafka, for example, he never was interested in becoming a famous writer throughout his life. He just wrote because he just loved to write and engage with literature. And when he died, he actually asked his friend and his editor to burn all the rest of his manuscripts. Well, he didn't, and he published them after his death. Kafka is now known as one of the, you know, greatest, you know, most influential writers of the 20th century, extremely important literary figure. But he wasn't seeking to become, you know, I want to be that famous writer. He was just doing it for the love of it.
Just the act in itself.
Right, exactly. You know, to engage with the act in and of itself. That's right. You know, and I think that's more authentic than well, I want to be, you know, I want to be Steven Tyler. You know what I mean? I want to be John Bon Jovi. Well, you're not engaging with it in an authentic way. You just want to, you see something and you want to copy it, another role, you know? I mean, it's exactly the same as saying, well, you know what? I want to be a garbage man. You know, there's no difference. It's just a role. It's just a job, you know? Really, when you say I want, you should be talking about what you as a person are and want to engage with. Everything else is just a label. I
guess in that way, you know, I want to be a rock star versus I want to play music.
Right.
And in the same way, I want to be a garbage man versus I want to help the environment. You know, there's being a garbage man, you're doing a finite role. Well, what if you're a garbage man, you're walking down the street and there's a piece of trash on the ground? Do you pick it up and put it in the trash can, or do you walk by it? There's a difference between doing the action and being the action.
Right. Mm-hmm.
So,
just like the waiter, I mean, you know, you're a waiter when you're at work. That's the suit you put on when you're at work. If you're walking past a restaurant and you see somebody with a dirty plate in front of them, do you just walk into the restaurant, pick it up, and take it to the kitchen? No, you're not a waiter inherently.
Right.
You know, that's just something that a role that you're filling for a period of time. You know, so you can't. So why would you say, oh well, you know, oh what do I do? Oh, I'm a waiter. Who are you? I'm a waiter. Well, why would you say that? Why would you use that as the baseline of who you are, as if that encompasses everything that you are, as if all waiters are exactly the same, right? So, oh, I'm a waiter. Oh, so you must be just like the waiter I met in Mississippi last week, right? Well, that's not true,
right?
You know, so it's insufficient to talk about things in those terms, you know, and that's why existentialism is here, you know, to get to the meat, you know, of what things really are.
I think it scares a lot of people to have those conversations. I think that's why it gets pushed to the side. I think that's why philosophy in general gets pushed to the side.
Yeah.
And all philosophers talk about the leisure of being able to sit around and philosophize. But I have to disagree with that to a certain extent, because even the person whose main goal is to get food, if they live in a situation where they're living meal to meal, they're still at points in time thinking, why am I in this situation where I have to where I don't know where my next meal is coming from? What is happening in reality that's making this be my reality? Now, obviously, they're not going to then sit and write a large book or do things of that. They could, but you know, obviously, the vast majority of people aren't doing that. But I don't believe that that only people who have time of leisure are able to really think on these subjects. I think that everyone philosophizes in some degree based on the situation that they're in. Well, they philosophize about the situation they're in based on that situation. But when you get to these, I guess you could call them a higher level of ideas. I don't really know if I would call it that, but I guess some people do. It's actually quite simple. The ideas that are being put forth, they're actually very sobering. They look at reality with all the layers peeled away. I think when you look at a field like psychology or anthropology, specific fields inside of them, that complicates the ideas that are being studied instead of looking at the whole. I think everything in society is so broken down in the idea that when you look at the field of psychology, where you have neuropsychology, you have personality, you have chemical, you have biological, you have all these different fields, but they're all just studying the mind. And then on a higher level of that, you have psychology, sociology, ethics, philosophy, religion, all the humanities. Well, that is humanity. That is people as they are. But those fields are those people broken down into those specific fields of study. So existentialism to me is that meta level of recognition of reality. It's taking all these things and looking at just what is, of looking at reality simply for what it is. And I think that scares a lot of people because we're put into these little boxes of saying that, oh, I'm a lawyer, I'm a married lawyer, and I live in North Carolina, in Raleigh, North Carolina, in whatever neighborhood, and but that's not you. That's not humanity.
Right.
The person living in Bangladesh is not you. But you are both still people. You are still a part of the larger part of humanity. And the action that you do in Raleigh, North Carolina is having an indirect effect on the person in Bangladesh, whether you realize it or not, because we're all a collective part of reality. Well, actually, just a perfect example would be if you're buying a piece of clothing made from one of the people in the sweatshop of Bangladesh.
Exactly, yeah. The interconnectedness of the world now is at the point where it's impossible to divorce yourself from things that are going on elsewhere in the world. I mean, it's a very real thing. I mean, we interact with, just in consumerism like that, people from across the globe all the time. I mean, that's how the American Western societies have such cheap clothing, is because of the extension of capitalism into the third world, places like Bangladesh, So you can't avoid not being in the world.
And in that sense, by buying those clothes, you are playing a direct role into keeping people impoverished. Because these substandard ways of practice of these sweatshops and these poorly constructed buildings that these people are working in for pennies a day, they that exists because there's a market to buy those clothes, and that there is a very large profit to be made making them in Bangladesh versus making them in America. India is becoming more industrialized, and they're getting a lot of jobs over there. But I was reading an article. Actually, this is a really interesting little side. J.P. Morgan has a program that they actually provide food stamps to people in, I believe it's 24 states in America. And 18 of those 24 states, they have a contract of somewhere, it's like 560 million, roughly a little over 500 million. Well, to help make sure that they make as much profit as possible off of food stamps, nonetheless, they have outsourced the calls that the people get, the people who get the food stamps make, to India, where the average person at those call centers is making $3.50 an hour, American money. So that just right there, all those pieces that I just said, you just kind of see the interconnectivity of humanity just in that one example on such multiple levels.
And then all those things are used as forms of political theater in order to influence individuals' thought processes.
Oh, exactly. And that I believe that capitalism and this global creation has proven existentialism beyond a level that any of these old existentialists could have ever done.
Yeah.
Because we're seeing the direct effect that a person's action on one side of the world has on a person on the other side of the world through these networks of capitalism and consumerism and financial. It's actually to me that creates the existentialist crisis more so than anything, because when you see these direct effects that your actions are having, and they seem like minuscule actions. You know, you go to a store and you buy something, and on the package it says "Made in China."
Right.
But you don't really think about it.
Yeah.
You don't even really think about, you know, if you think about it was made in China, well, think of the effect it's having on the American workers who have lost jobs because those jobs were shipped over to China to make that product. The effect that it's having on the Chinese person who is working in a shop, maybe making substandard wages or working in substandard working conditions. The enormity of the situation of each individual action that a person does, people don't. It's almost inconceivable. It's almost impossible for a person to really understand that every single little what is considered by them to be an insignificant action actually has more significance than they will ever be able to understand.
Exactly.
That's a scary realization. I think that's
Well, it presupposes that you have a massive amount of responsibility.
Exactly.
Well, exactly,
It's
yeah.
a massive responsibility, and it's a massive burden, and that's why people don't want to accept it. You know, and I think our society in the West is experiencing a mass existential crisis.
Absolutely.
You know, because of consumerism, you know, because of the negative effects on our environment, you know, because of the restrictiveness of governments, people don't know where they fit in the world anymore. You know, those roles are breaking down, and we're going through this whole existential angst collectively as a society. You know, and you know what? I don't know what's on the other side of it.
Yeah.
But it may be that as people take accountability and start realizing some of these things, that situations will improve. You know, if society itself becomes self-aware through this crisis that we're going through. You know, because it's horrifying in a lot of ways when you look around at the world. You know, and you see this, you know, well, Kafka-esque, you know, world that we all seem to be surrounded by constantly. I mean, if you just sit somewhere in public and critically think and break down the things that are happening around you in a shopping mall or something, for example, I mean, you get this feeling of horror and disgust.
Depressing as all hell.
You know, it's terrifying. You know, and I think a lot of people feel that. You know, just this environment that we're in is just not healthy.
It's almost like it's a combination of the idea that we're all sort of fallen, that we're just inherently flawed, so we've just all fallen into this sort of capitalistic scheme of dedicating our lives to acquiring stuff that we don't even need, instead of recognizing our own inherent value and our own inherent uniqueness and projecting that onto the world as an individual.
Right.
You know, another thing we're as a typical critique of existentialism, we're seeming to dwell on some of the negatives of humanity. But let's look at the person who wants to be green, who wants to live naturally, who is taking upon themselves to be independent and self-sustainable. Well, think of the effect that that's having on the rest of society who isn't doing that. You may be by becoming independent, then the person who relied on you to buy materials or buy food, let's say if you have your own garden and you're able to sustain your food supply, the farmer who was selling their crops to you, well, now they don't have anyone to sell it to, so the food may go bad. and they may not be able to provide for their family other needs that by growing those foods was able to meet. So it goes both ways. Whether you feel that you're really doing great things for society, or whether you're doing what is considered, I mean, it's all interpretation of what the action is. All actions have reactions because of those actions.
Absolutely.
So it's not about right and wrong. That's the thing. That's the thing that bothers me the most is the labeling of the action and the reaction. We can accept that everything in the world is dualistic at its core, but it's the definition of the sides. It's like when you look at the yin and yang, one doesn't represent good and one doesn't represent bad. Even the ideas of the masculine and the feminine inside of them is not purely masculine and purely feminine.
Right.
It is an interplay inside of the oneness that is. So to label something anything other than an action and a reaction is limiting it in a way that you will never, well, all you really have to do is take a step back to realize the implications that it's having on reality. When you simply look at something as an action and a reaction, it doesn't create the set of circumstances that the label creates. Because when you have an action and you have a reaction, well, when you label the action as something, that labeling of the action is actually severely limiting what the reaction can be. And oftentimes the reaction must be then the opposite of that action based on the definition of the action that you create. So by doing that, by labeling an action and a reaction as good or bad or right or wrong or whatever you choose, you're actually pigeonholing the action in a way that ultimately is having almost no effect on a society in a progressive or even a regressive way. It's creating a neutrality in a very bizarre manner, actually, because by labeling things as good and bad, you're perpetuating the idea. Right. You're not moving anything forward. So when you just simply have an action and reaction, it's moving. Wherever it's moving, it's moving. If it's moving, it's just moving forward in the sense that there is an action, then there's reactions to those actions, then reactions to those actions, and so on and so forth. But with the labeling of those actions, it's leading it in that direction of the good and bad, the good and bad, the good and bad, the good and bad. It keeps going like that.
Like a feedback loop.
Yeah. It's like when a record skips.
Right. And
it's the same thing over and over again. And it's only when you slightly move it and quit allowing that obstruction to be in the way.
Oh, they have a name for that in chaos mathematics. I forget what it is. But basically, if I were to take a camera and plug it into the TV and videotape the TV and the camera videotaping itself, it's like a continuum. It's like a visual feedback loop, right?
Right, sure.
Sort of going back to what you're saying of things constantly reacting with each other. It goes on ad infinitum until something slightly changes, and then a whole new paradigm can sort of unfold from it.
It's like the infinite mirror effect when you have two mirrors looking at each other, and it goes out like that. And that's exactly the point of that, is that when you have these two things looking at themselves, you see the infinite possibilities in each thing.
Right.
But at the core, they're still just two.
They're the reflection of each other.
Exactly. Yeah. So it's only when you have two mirrors and you stick, let's just say a pencil in between those two mirrors, and you see on one mirror an infinite amount of pencils, and you see on the other mirror an infinite amount of pencils. Well, would you label the mirror to your right as being the wrong mirror, or that isn't a proper view of the pencil? and that the mirror on the other side is the proper view of the pencil, that's just absurd. They're both the view of the pencil. They're both the image of the pencil. There is no... It's all the same. It just is. It's just... It is the representation of that in an infinite way.
Which is the exact reason why the Buddhists and even the Taoists had what they called no self.
Yeah.
Anatman, you know?
Right. Yeah.
There is no inherent you. You're just a projection of all these different influences. And yet, there's a unique you.
Right, yeah, exactly. An indefinable you, really.
Right.
You know, which is, of course, I mean, it's a concept that's very difficult to actually conceive of in your mind, right? That, you know, there really isn't a me,
right,
besides the me that's actually making the choices, right? And those choices are being made on the basis of past experience, sure, but you're making that choice now, in the moment. You are recreating an aspect of the universe now, in the moment, you know? And I think, you know, I mean, all this, there is no good and evil, right? There is no some grand celestial struggle for good and evil, right? And the world does not care. The world does not care about you as an individual, right? But we act in it. And we have the absolute power to act in it. And I think that idea, the idea that we ourselves manufacture whatever meaning there is really the beautiful thing about being alive.
Right.
You know, that in every moment we can choose to do things that allow us to express our freedom and to allow others to express our freedom. And I think that's really the goal here, is to allow every human being, without exception, to be able to fully realize that they are a free actor in the world. And they're able to utilize that freedom to help others and to exist, you know, peaceably in a world that allows them to be what they are, not what is projected upon them to be.
And even going back to the Taoist perspective, you know, the Taoists weren't going for yin over yang or yang over yin. They're emphasizing harmony.
Exactly.
Harmony was the emphasis.
Their saying was go with the flow.
Right.
To be effortless. To just go with, well, as Bruce Lee said, to be like water.
Right.
Which is actually the Taoist idea. They hold water in that sense.
In Tao, you know, they say a wise man can never explain the Tao.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, the Tao is the Tao. It's unfathomably complex. No language or word or philosophy will ever be able to encapsulate it. And yet here we are, we're these unique agents in this thing called the Tao. Yeah. And it's like, what do? We go with it. We have to harmonize ourselves with it.
Exactly.
Take part in the dance and express ourselves, our uniqueness, as a part of this holistic ebb and flow.
I believe that the angst, despair, and anger we suffer in our societies is because instead of following that and living, you know, in a harmonious way, we instead try to control and conquer both ourselves and the world around us and the universe itself. You know, I think it's because we are fighting so hard against existence that we cannot be happy in it.
Right.
And then we have to let that go. We have to transcend that kind of way of thinking.
So I mean, we're fighting against ourselves.
Right.
That's really what it is.
You know, you're banging your head against a wall.
Sartre, he had a story that he said about when Abraham was visited by the quote unquote angel, and the angel told him to kill his first son, and Sartre said, "Wow, how can we know whether or not that was an angel? It could have been a devil. It could have been an evil spirit, and who says that Abraham is Abraham? Only you define yourself as what you are. He could have been talking to someone else. And having voices, you know, when you have a voice in your head, who's to say that is God talking to you? Maybe it's a demonic voice. But you define all these things. The point is you define all these things as you do. And when it's sort of the idea of when an angel comes down to Abraham and says, to kill his first son. When he looks at this being, now let's just say that this is all based on the definition of what we call an angel. You think of an angel with white wings and dressed in a white robe and a halo. Well, what if in fact that's an evil deity? But we're only giving it that connotation based on that idea. When if an angelic being, if a quote unquote angel and a demon came to you, and they both just stood in front of you, you define which one is which if you choose to go down that road. If you just look at both of them simply as they are, even if one is dressed as the quintessential definition that we define as an angel, one is dressed in the quintessential definition that we define as a demon, if you have that as your reference point to which one is which, well then you've now created the idea of good and evil. But if you just simply look at both of them and see no concept of that, you just see two beings, well then good and evil have no power. It just is. And all action at that point is simply is. And I think it's like Jiddu Krishnamurti when he said when you tell a child, when a child sees a bird and asks what it is, and you say, well, that's a sparrow, the child ceases to see the bird as it is ever again. It now makes the reference every time it sees it as a sparrow. Well, that's it with everything. As soon as you label an action or a thing as being something, it's limited to that. And in the sense of good and evil, I mean, really all you have to do is just look at Hitler and Gandhi. Hitler thought that what he was doing was good. Gandhi thought that what he was doing was good. But it's all up to interpretation, because each person that followed Gandhi versus each person that followed Hitler, they for themselves created the idea of which person was right and which person was wrong, which ideal was right and which ideal was wrong. Instead of simply looking at it as because this is what I think everyone needs to realize. When I say moving past the idea of right and wrong, good and evil, I'm sure you sit there and you think, well, that's just an absurd notion. Well, here's the thing. When you sit there and you listen to a person say something that inherently is psychotic, you don't have to label the words as crazy. You can simply just tell that from listening to the words being said. There's no reason to label it as good or bad. You just simply realize that for which it is. You don't have to label it. You can simply walk away and say, well, I want no part in that. It is when you label it as good and bad that then creates the debate. Because if you stand up and say to that person, no, you are crazy, that is nonsense, that is evil, well, now you've just created a debate. Because whoever agrees with him will stand up and say, no, you're wrong, that is good what he is saying. Well, now you've just created the two ideas of good and evil just in that thought. But if you simply just take the words for what are being said as the words that are being said and do not label them either way, well, then those labels have no power. You only give the words the power that they have the moment you label them as one or the other. That is the power of the oneness of the duality. And I think that's what a lot of people forget. I think because our society loves words, and that is the only way in which we have to communicate, that is the reason why so much of society is the way it is, because we're very limited with words. Words are the reason why society is the way it is, because it's the only way we have to define the things that we see.
And they aren't necessarily limiting and constraining. The idea is not the word.
Right.
Right? You know, an idea, a concept like freedom
Yeah.
isn't the word. The word freedom doesn't, it represents something, an idea that many people may have slightly different conceptions of, right? But that's the word we use just for that one thing. But that's not the idea that actually happens inside our head, right? And it's not the reality of it. It's just a word. And then words can be dangerous. I mean, look at constructs like race, for example. You know, I mean, you use words to define people into different races and classes, right? Even gender. You know, I mean, male and female they have connotations that go beyond the male of a species and the female of a species. They go into like these gender roles of what you expect a man to be or what you expect a woman to be, right? And it leaves out, you know, a whole breadth, a whole spectrum of interesting possibilities that lie within the concept of gender. You know, exactly. It's, you know, it's very simple, and it's isolating, because when you put a label on someone or a thing, it isolates it as that thing.
Yeah.
You know, it's difficult to talk about these concepts because we're constrained by language even when we speak about them. But you know, and it's tempting to create all these new words to define things, but really we don't need that. What we need is the actual understanding, some way to actually understand the concept itself.
Maybe a new medium. Maybe it's time we make a new medium.
Right.
You know, like the Gnostic philosopher Philos Judaeus said, he waits for a time when the logos isn't told but is beheld.
Right. Yeah.
Which is interesting to contemplate.
I think it was I may have used this metaphor before, but it's a salient one. You know, Rumi, its metaphor of the rose. That he could speak about a rose to someone for hours and not come close to allowing that person to understand what a rose smells like. But if he hands him a rose and that person smells the rose, then they have a shared experience by which they can